will be recorded, which I've just started, and all registrants will receive a link to the recording. And with that, I will turn things over to Dr. Dollar.
All right, thank you very much, Joe, and welcome everybody to our webinar today. If we can have the next slide, Joe.
Mm-hmm.
Next slide.
Yeah, just bear with me.
Okay.
Oops. Having a bit of a difficult. Oh, there we go. Dr. Dollar, can you see the screen?
I see the screen. It's a title slide, so I need next slide.
Oh, okay. It's
okay. So
okay.
Today, what we'd like to talk about, really in general, what are the 5 ingredients of a successful transplant evaluation process? And there's some common themes that go throughout this. The first is communication. Communication between the referring doctors regarding the patients who are not candidates, as well as those who are candidates. Want to work on how to incorporate technology tools to really increase or to handle the increased patient data from the initial screening process all the way through obtaining your test results in order to ensure regulatory compliance. We'd like to also establish some guidelines for multidisciplinary team assessments to streamline the process as well as ensure compliance. Also, we'd like to look at what are some of the best practices for waitlist management. A lot of times people get placed on the waiting list after the evaluation process and seem to be forgotten about for a period of time. And then lastly, if you recall from our last webinar where we talked about developing outreach programs to help with business development, how do you align your transplant evaluation process with your outreach so it becomes seamless and very efficient? Next slide. Next slide, Joe.
Yeah, it's
All right. So before we go through and talk to Gary about the transplant evaluation process, just wanted to put out what are the things that comprise the transplant evaluation process. It's not just that initial evaluation visit, but there's a lot more that goes into it. So there's the intake process where the program learns about the patient, receives records through record retrieval, an initial screen both from a finance perspective as well as the medical record review. The education visit is of vital importance to teach the patients what they need to know about transplant as well as meet all the regulatory requirements. The actual visit itself when they come in and meet the members of the multidisciplinary team. The testing that goes on after that initial visit, collating all the material and bringing it forward to your patient selection committee meeting to make a decision then and finally to waitlist management. Next slide. Next slide, Joe.
Yeah, I've advanced it on my screen. There may be a bit of a delay.
Okay, so Gary, when the patient first contacts the program, I think that's really where that relationship starts then between the patient and feeling comfortable with the program. Can you talk about the importance of that first impression and what are some of the goals of that initial call?
Sure, John. First, I'd like to begin by thanking everybody for being on this presentation today. And just by the sheer number of people who are on this webinar, I think that there's a lot of challenges out there. And I would like to reflect on my many years' experience as a coordinator myself and maybe give some contrast comparisons of what I've seen by other transplant programs who have struggled with the evaluation process. Like John said, the initial contact is the most important. And what type of person there is making that contact. So the structure of your program is very important. And you can, there's a lot of work that can be done by non-clinical organized, say, administrative assistants or medical assistants. So we're going to talk a little bit about structure throughout the first part of the evaluation process. So the first person that makes contact is a referral that comes in to probably an administrative assistant who is going to make that first impression. So you want to gain information on that patient. So demographics is very important, obviously, and we probably all do that pretty well by gaining insurance information and then collecting. At this point, you want to collect some information because we're going to talk about a pre-screening process, which is key to having an efficient evaluation process. So you want to be able to coach your administrative assistants to ask key questions such as, how long has the patient been on dialysis? Because that's going to tell your team how quickly this patient may need to be worked up. So they've been on dialysis for 5 or 10 years, they may go to the top of the list once they're evaluated. Where if they've not started dialysis yet, maybe this is somebody who goes a little further towards the back of the triage line. Also, you want to collect a medical release form at this point, or send a medical release form and a health history document to the patient's home that will be brought back, that will be sent back in through a self-addressed stamped envelope to your transplant team. So as they begin the first visit, and we'll talk a little bit more about the first visit here in just a little bit. So that's the initial contacts. You want to script a call to the patient that's going to collect certain information that's going to be put into your EMR or your transplant database to help start to facilitate the workup process and also the financial clearance process. So, John, you want to talk about the next slide?
Oh, okay. Yeah, thanks, Gary. I think, obtaining all that information early on is very important. Next slide, Joe. I'm not sure why the slides are loading slow today. It must be the bad weather we're having here. So the next slide, I think, talks about financial clearance and financial evaluation. Gary, can you comment on that in terms of the importance and what are the different possibilities? I mean, obviously, if patient's insurance fits with your program, everything's good, but I know that sometimes things don't always work out the way you want them to. Well, how can a program still help a patient in those situations?
Sure. So at this point, you've collected some basic demographic information, and you want to be able to evaluate whether or not the patient's going to be able to stay at your program, or whether or not you're going to have to send that patient to maybe another program that's in network that's best for the patient, or maybe contact your contracting department to get a letter of agreement to work that patient up in your system.
Oh, okay. And, with the waiting time, there's always a possibility that people's insurance, what they come in with, may not be what they're on tomorrow, right? And also, if people can switch over to Medicare after how many months now? Gary? Did we lose Gary?
Yes, that'd be after 18 months.
Oh, okay. All right, great. Next slide.
I'm showing financial clearance. Dr. Dollar, do you see that?
We just did that one while we were waiting, okay. So next slide.
All right. I apologize, everyone, having some difficulty advancing the slides.
So Gary, before the patient comes in for the initial visit, right, the next slide is going to talk about sort of that review of the clinical information. What are some of the considerations at that point? You know,
yes, this
before
is
the
what
patient even comes in.
this is what I like to call the pre-screening review. So you collected a certain amount of information that each of your programs have defined for pre-screening, such as you would want to get like a H&P, maybe a lab that would calculate a MELD score. Maybe they've had screening for cancer in the past 5 years. Maybe they had a colonoscopy in the last 1 year. Maybe some recent cardiac testing. So each program should define a few items that would allow them to do a pre-screening process. So at this point, they've not even been assigned to a coordinator. This is all information that's being collected by an administrative assistant or a medical assistant.
Okay.
At this point, the medical records are put into an EMR because of the sheer volume you're getting in, because you have an aggressive outreach program. You need some kind of text recognition program to be able to put this information in your system. And at this point, so you've collected, say, some basic information on the patient. Then you're going to have pre-screening done by a physician or a senior coordinator that's going to look for those hard items that are going to be contraindications to transplant. So you're going to pre-screen out a certain volume of patients at this point, so they don't clog up your system and go through and be assigned to coordinators and spend their time being worked up that aren't going to be candidates anyway.
Okay, so I think that's important because, you know, I know we used to get 1,000 pages of records sometimes on some patients, and maybe only about 10 to 15 of those pages have information that I really need. So I think the ability to create a report and have a system that can pull the data that you're going to make a decision on or could be actionable early on is very important. Well, what happens, Gary, if you know you identify a patient that you're not quite sure, or you're definitely sure he's not going to be a candidate? You know, somebody who gets referred who's got a stage 4 cancer, for example, metastatic disease. Well, do you just tell the patient sorry, or how do you recommend handling that?
No, at that stage, so you've had a clinician to review those records. At that point, a phone call should occur. And what we do at my program is we have a physician actually call the referring physician and discuss that referral and that the patient is not a candidate for this reason. So there's a dialogue between the physicians. And this is also a very important component of your outreach program. So you begin to forge relationships out in the community, even through patients that you're not going to work up in your system, and provide education to the referring physician of your criteria for transplant.
Right. Okay, yeah, I know. I remember we would always get, whenever we started working with a new group, patients we got were never the ones who had living donors or you know, tumors on the liver. That would be easy cases. It was always the ones that, you know, were complex and were borderline candidates to begin with. Next slide, please. So at this point, we'd like to ask the audience a poll question. And as Joseph said before, if you just answer, and then at the end of the webinar, the results will be collated and we'll get them sent out to all the attendees. And the question is, would it be useful to have a software tool that can help separate and process documents in the referral packet that you receive, either prior to the patient coming in for his evaluation visit or what you have them complete at the initial time? And the choices are, and you can pick as many of these as you would like. Would it be useful for it to separate the documents in the PDF and then classify them by document type? In addition, with routing specific document types to the appropriate workflow for further processing, such as getting insurance forms over to admissions be useful. And then finally, with the ability to capture and incorporate discrete patient data, such as lab results or radiology reports, for example, into the EHR and customize flow sheets or reports, would that be helpful? So we'll just leave that slide up for a minute so the audience can answer, and then Joe, whenever you're ready, you can advance to the next slide.
Okay.
And as I said, we'll collate the results at the end of the webinar, and we'll have the results shared electronically with all the attendees. All right, so after that pre-screening, now comes the initial evaluation. And I think, Gary, you identified a couple of types of patients. Clearly you'll have the patient who everything is good, so you're just going to go straight to the education class. We can talk about that in a minute. But what about these other patients who might be iffy? Clearly you're not going to say no right away. How do you bring them in, and what do you do with those patients in that initial visit?
Yeah, so we have, so now we have done our pre-screening, so we have broken them down into 3 categories. So you have the first category of patient that would be a high-risk patient, but not excluded from evaluation yet. So we're going to schedule a physician evaluation, but no testing. So this is a one-time visit to come in and see a transplant physician, but no testing occurs. In the second category of patients is going to be your expedited clinic, or your patients that are going to go through the system. So they're assigned a coordinator at this point. This is the only group that's assigned a clinical coordinator at this point. All the other work has been done by a non-clinical person, or AA or MA. And then the third category would be the not a candidate, and then the physician phone call that occurred. So we're going to talk about the first 2 groups of patients. So we need to educate by regulation. We need to educate these patients and do an informed consent. So we're going to have 2 types of clinics. We're going to have the group 1 patient with eval, no testing, and then the number 2 that's going to be an expedited clinic. So your education class is going to be shifted to the day of clinic, and you're going to have evaluation day. So the patients will come in early in the morning, and all the group 1 and 2 patients will go to education class, and we're going to focus our education on evaluation, because that's the informed consent that needs to occur. And that's where we're going to focus on also the regulatory requirements, such as the program outcomes, multi-listing awareness, and of course the informed consent for evaluation.
Okay, thank you. And I think that really helps improve efficiency by really stratifying the types of patients you see in any one given clinic session, because it allows people to get into a certain mindset, certain workflow, rather than bouncing back from a pre-patient to a post-patient, so on and so forth. Next slide, Joe.
Mm-hmm.
So after the patients complete their education class, they have to see all the members of the multidisciplinary team, or they have to be evaluated in some way. And Gary, I know that you've been very successful using screening tools, so if you can talk about how that applies, and then some of the other considerations, because I see the goal here is to get the patient from the evaluation visit to patient selection committee meeting in 90 days. So I have a feeling that you have a couple of tidbits for us on how to get that to occur.
Sure. So now we're having a multidisciplinary clinic, and that's going to be our evaluation day, especially for our group 2, who's going to go straight through the evaluation. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have a round-robin clinic. So each patient's going to be assigned a room. You don't want to overbook because if you only have 6 clinic rooms, you can only see 6 patients on an evaluation day. And so the multidisciplinary team is going to rotate clinic rooms. And so since you have a limited amount of rooms, but you may have 6 people on your multidisciplinary team, develop screening tools for instance, the dietitian or nutritionist. Develop screening tools for your pharmacist, because they don't necessarily need to see every patient, but they need to be involved in the assessment of each patient. So the clinic assistants or the coordinators can fill out a screening tool and have a scoring system to determine whether or not that pre-candidate actually needs to have a consult by the pharmacist or the dietitian. So that's where I use screening tools. Mm-hmm. So I don't have every patient seeing those 2 consults. But every patient would see a social worker, a transplant financial coordinator, visit with the coordinator about the health history form, and the physicians. And then we also want to consider on this day, so we've had the education class that may last an hour. We've had the round robin with the team that may last up to 3 hours. We can also do some block scheduling testing on this day. For instance, you might be able to get block scheduling for some echocardiograms or block scheduling for radiology tests. And certainly you can do all your laboratory tests on this day. So you can knock out a big chunk of your evaluation in one single day.
Okay, great. Yeah, I know, I've had some physicians say, oh, we'd rather have 15 patients in at one time and then they can come back and see the other members of the team. Do you think that's a good idea, or do you think that really confuses the patient?
Oh, I think there can be issues with, scheduling like that in a fragmented way. You certainly want to focus as much of the testing in one day as you can, or maybe even possibly 2 days, have the patient spend the night and do as much of the testing in 2 days as you can.
Right.
But once we get to the next slide, I think we'll provide some clarity on how to maybe, if you're a very congested program, maybe how to uncongest your program a little bit.
Okay, great. So the next slide then does talk about that testing phase, and it seems that it can be a black hole for patients sometimes, that they never come at it. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure, and what I've seen other programs struggle with, and I'll ask them about how long does it take to work up your patients. And I mean, I hear some programs take as much as a year sometimes to work a patient up. And I all the time hear, 6 months, no less than 6 months. Well, that's just really too long. So you need to find creative ways to uncongest your program. So we've talked about use of the administrative assistants or EMAs throughout the first part, and not using your clinical coordinators, which are very valuable, very expensive to the program. And so now let's talk about the actual testing. So using block time can help. But if you're in a quaternary care facility, and probably most of us are because we're a transplant facility, you're probably a level 1 trauma center, so you're a quaternary care center. So the backlog in your ancillary system is probably very common. So, I can't get block scheduling, or I can't get a cardiac eval done within a week of the referral. So here's where you might want to look at doing some contracts with outside facilities. So look at where your referrals are coming from. Maybe it's 100 miles away in another city that doesn't have a transplant program. You can do contracts out there to let them do some of the testing, and then have those bills sent into your financial department, and then put those on your cost report. That's very allowable. So what this does, it creates, again, going to your outreach program, it creates community awareness of your transplant program. It forges relationships with other health systems, and it will increase overall referrals, especially if you're a multi-organ program, because you're forging relationships with outside facilities to do the testing. And oftentimes, because they have skin in the game, you can have them, they will do the prior authorization, or you provide the prior authorization details if it's a global contract, and then they will also schedule the test for the patient when it's convenient for them locally in their own hometown. So that's how you can kind of decongest. Now here's some of the pros and cons of doing this. So some of the pros are you can get quicker testing and turnaround time. It creates and forges relationships regarding outreach. Some of the cons are you have a lot of data management. So you've got testing coming in, you got reports coming in, being faxed in or sent into your organization. So this is where our sponsor of today's webinar can really come in handy through Extract Systems, being able to extract data from these reports and actually put them into your EMR. So data management can be one of the cons of using outside facilities.
Okay, thank you. I think, one of the things that, as you were presenting that, it kind of made me think about our previous set of blogs and webinar regarding outreach. And it really sounds like it's very important for all components of the program to kind of work together. So, I mean, you can encourage a lot of referrals into your program, but then if you don't have an efficient way of managing them, you're not going to get repeat referrals from those places because they're not going to be happy with the service. So I think it's very important that your outreach links to your clinical activity as well. The other thing that I thought of as you were speaking was it sounds like if you go to the outside for some of the testing, I can imagine that data management can become an issue. Can you comment on that?
Sure. The last part of that discussion, it was the pros and cons because the volume of information that you would have coming in from outside facilities would greatly increase. It's not going to be like you schedule something out of radiology and it's going to pop into your EMR. It's going to be, probably sent in, and then it's going to have to be input into your EMR or your transplant database.
Okay. So it's not only the volume, but then you got to worry about accuracy and compliance with regulations, make sure you got your 2 ABOs and things like that.
Correct.
All right. Next slide, Joe. All right, so now after all this, you have to pull all this data together. How does that work, Gary, in terms of, well, what's the role of the coordinator, the patient selection meeting? Is it just a rubber stamp? Or?
So the transplant coordinator is the person that usually presents the patient to the transplant team. And of course the physicians are involved, but it's usually the coordinator presenting the patient information. So one of the things you want to have available in the room is, your data management system available there, whether it be up on a screen or somebody have a computer, just in case you have to pull a primary source document. For instance, if you do it outside, use an outside facility to do an echocardiogram on a patient who's in evaluation, well, that may be clear for so it may be clear for surgery in a community facility, but if you have a cardiologist in the room, they may say, well, it's not clear from a transplant standpoint, so we need to go on and do some more testing, for instance, a heart cath or something. So you want to be able to have that primary source documents available to the team. So you need to have some type of data management system that's going to allow you to retrieve not just the conclusion, but the entire document and the information in that document. And then you also want to have, of course, we all know we need to define selection criteria for our programs. So usually you would have either the coordinator or a quality coordinator there defining the selection, if the patient meets the selection criteria. And then we need to, at that point, once the selection meeting is over, we need to notify the patient of the decision within 10 days of the selection committee decision.
Right. Okay. Thanks. Next slide. And I just want to add to that, when we've reviewed programs, that's one of the things that has come up at several of them, that the lack of that documentation of what actually happens at the selection meeting. You know, I know pretty much all programs keep minutes of those meetings, but when the auditors come in, they really want to see in the medical record for a given patient what was discussed about them, and you know how they did or did not meet the selection criteria. So I'm glad you brought that up, Gary, because I think that's a key compliance point.
I think that's one of the number one things we actually see out in programs.
Yeah. All right. So after the selection committee meeting and notification that the patients are now on the list, you know, we always hear about, oh, how do we handle the wait list? And I mean, clearly it differs by organ, where some organs are allocated by disease severity scores, and you know, kidneys are a little bit different, although now that, as you mentioned, patients can come in with a lot of time. Can you comment on some of the wait list management issues?
Sure. I actually feel that the sicker the patient is, the easier it is to wait list manage them, because they're coming into your facility more often. Those patients that wait for a long time, many days or many years on a transplant list, those are the ones that are most challenging, because there can be changes throughout the months and years, such as their disease progression. If you're only seeing them, and you may not have a need to see them but once every 6 months, hopefully you're getting reports from their referring physician. But these are the patients that can fall through the crack. You want to see your patient at least every 6 months while they're on the waiting list, because they can have situations change, other comorbidities that come up. Maybe they have loss of the support system, a divorce, or something like that. So you want to be able to schedule those patients at least at 6 months intervals who may not be high on the list.
Okay. Now with the next slide, I think we talk about the comorbidities. You talked about the social support systems, and I guess similar things can happen with the financial situations as well, right?
Absolutely. And if you have hundreds and hundreds of patients to manage, you need to have a good data management system that's going to help trigger the follow-up, the intervals of follow-up visits.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And again, it sounds like data management is really key here, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. Next slide. So I think in summary, we did kind of touch upon these 5 ingredients, focusing on communication with referring doctors, establishing guidelines for that initial team assessment so that the evaluation process can be very streamlined, efficient, patient-friendly, using technology whenever possible to help ease the workload and the burden of the data management on the transplant staff. So as we said before, they can really do what they do best, which is spend time with the patients. And then we talked a little bit about best practices for waitlist management and how important that is, and the importance of having your overall business model, i.e. your outreach program, really aligned with the clinical operational portion of your program as well to make everything run smoothly for the patient. Next slide. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending, and we'd like to open it up for questions. I know at our last webinar we ran out of time for more questions, so we'd like to give a little bit more time today to our attendees to see what areas we can help them with. And then also, just as a reminder, our next series of blogs in the webinar will deal with system improvement agreements, or SIAs. What are they? How do we deal with it? So with that, Joe, I'll turn it over to you to help moderate the questions.
Yes, thanks, Dr. Dollar. And a question submitted but unanswered during the webinar will be answered via email. And again, the presentation will be recorded, and all registrants will receive a link to the recording. So there are a couple of questions for Dr. Dollar and Gary. The first one, in terms of QAPI programs, what are some examples of the most important events/activities to measure?
I think as far as indicators for the QAPI that most programs should be monitoring is the time from referral date to, say, financial clearance, and then financial clearance to patient selection or listing.
Okay.
So those are some quality indicators. John, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think from a regulatory perspective, I would just add making sure that you have that consent to evaluation done before the evaluation process starts.
Sure.
That's something that's very tangible. You can look at a date of, on a signature page of a consent form, and then look at, when that evaluation visit was. And if the consent form comes after the evaluation visit, then that's a problem. And I think that's a great example of, the question I asked Gary before about what do you think about just bringing in 20 patients across a day to have the 3 or 4 physicians in the transplant program see them, and then bring back those patients for the rest of their testing. Well, that's a great setup for being out of compliance, because that initial visit with the physician is part of the evaluation process. And if you don't have the consent form by then, that's going to be a problem when you get audited. And then the other one, I think, coming out of the evaluation process and listing process is making sure that you have the 2 ABOs done. But prior to a listing drawn at separate times. I think that Gary's comment about using your QAPI program to really manage the referral and evaluation process can really show you early on when things may be getting bogged down and offer you opportunities to improve so that your referring doctors and patients don't become dissatisfied with your program.
Great. Another question for Dr. Dollar and Gary. In your experience, what are the problems you face in setting up an evaluation as described in the presentation?
Gary, you want to take a crack to start, or you want me to?
Well, I think that right sizing your program and having the right, like we discussed early on in the evaluation, is that you want to use your administrative staff as much as possible to collect information that either a senior coordinator, a nurse practitioner, or ideally a physician can look at pre-screen records to really define 3 categories of patients. That be the evaluation, no testing, full evaluation assigned to the coordinator, and not a candidate at this program, let's call the referring physician. I think utilizing that non-clinical staff and right-sizing your program so you don't have your RN coordinators doing everything from start to finish on these patients is probably the biggest pearl in this discussion that you should walk away with. So right-size your program and use
And unfortunately, I don't think that there's any one product that solves all the problems. Certainly you have the big health system-wide EMRs such as Epic and You have transplant modules in there, such as Phoenix. Then you also have individual transplant relational databases or electronic medical records, depending upon your viewpoint, teleresults, TransChart, Otter. You have healthcare retrieval systems, that can pull information in. I think one of the common things, though, between all of them is that your database or EMR that you use is only as good as the information that you can get into it. And I think in my experiences running programs and then looking at programs in our consulting role, the problem a lot of them face is they have all this data, but they don't know how to manage it. And I think that's where a text recognition type of product, such as what Extract has, is really helpful, because it eliminates the manual need to flip through, as I mentioned earlier in the webinar, 1,000 pages to find 4 or 5 discrete pieces of information. Or, when you send off your evaluation lab results, well, if you look at that primary source document, the physician, one day you're going to get the CBC and the SMAC6. The next day you're going to get the hepatitis serologies. The third day you're going to get your EBV and CMV serologies, yet they all come in the same packet. So you see the same data over and over again. So by having a text recognition system or intelligent record recognition system, that can really help streamline that workflow process.
Right, and actually, just as you and Gary were talking about during today's presentation, there's 5 ingredients of a successful process. There's a lot of parts have to come together and have to work as one to really make a successful process. And a data management system or an intelligent data extraction system like Extract provides is just one piece of that puzzle.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Yeah, and I believe that is all of the questions that we have for today. So I will wrap up by thanking Dr. Dollar and Gary Siegel for their participation here today. I hope the audience found the webinar helpful and informative and provided some value to them in their evaluation. And like I said, we will send all that attended and registered a recording of the webinar, and we look forward to the next series from both Dr. Dollar and Gary. So thank you very much, and thank you for attending.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
You too. Thank you.